There's one thing that Jesus told his disciples that I've found helpful many times, and it's been swimming around in my head as this current crisis has unfolded. And it comes from John chapter 16, verse 33, where Jesus said, "In this world you will have troubles, but take heart, I've overcome the world." This life is not trouble-free. Jesus didn't sugarcoat what it means to follow him. He was speaking directly, of course, to his disciples, and the particular trouble that he was referring to were the troubles that they would face for being his followers. And Jesus himself, of course, was no strange to troubles. He's described, remember, as a man of sorrows. That is, he was familiar with the pain and suffering of this life. He knew temptation, sorrow, fear, illness, death. He experienced rejection, loss, poverty, loneliness, abuse. There's not one tear we have shared that he doesn't understand. But in a broader sense, because we live in the same broken world, no one is immune from trouble. Life will be hard. Some are acutely aware of that fact for different reasons, perhaps because of the particular circumstances of their own lives. But there would be very few around the world right now who aren't painfully aware of our world's troubles. There is sorrow, pain, grief. And that in turn is leading people into hopelessness and despair. And despair in the end is a loss of hope. I read an article by a Christian lady named Christina Fox just this week, where she described her descent into depression and eventually into what she calls a pit of despair. She said, "I was a trained counsellor, and so I had tried all the things that I knew to do to manage it. And while she said that she found some temporary help from those things, none of it actually gave her the hope that she longed for and that she needed most. So eventually she decided to go and to meet with her pastor, the pastor of her church. She detailed for him everything that she had done to climb out of the pit, a list of coping skills, strategies to change her life's circumstances. But when she finished outlining all that she'd done, her pastor just simply replied to her, "But I haven't heard you tell me how you are trusting in what Christ already did for you." She said her first response was to wonder what that had to do with her state of despair. But she said that as I left his office, I did leave with a new seed of hope. It reminded me that my hope and joy are not found in what I can do, but in what Jesus has already done. And out of all the things that she had done to help herself, she said it was this that has given her lasting hope. Now, she's not claiming to be free from all moments of depression, but she says that the thing about despair is that it strips away hope, and the future becomes dark and bleak. And there are many people in our world right now who feel exactly that way. They can see no hope. They feel overwhelmed by despair and hopelessness. But the gospel of Jesus gives us hope. Here's what Jesus is actually saying. He says, in this world you will have trouble. Well, yes, of course, perhaps anyone could have actually made that particular claim, but no one can say what he says next, can they? What does he say? He says, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. See, here's the message that our world needs to hear right now. Here's the message that you and I need to be reminded of. And it's the message that the Apostle Peter is writing about. He's writing to the churches that have been scattered throughout Turkey at the time. It's written to Christians who are doing it tough. They're facing opposition, they're facing persecution, and they're doing it because of they're facing it because of their Christian faith, and it's knocking them around. And Peter is writing so as to urge them to stand firm as Christians And so he writes at the beginning there, to those who are elect exiles, notice, of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia. Peter puts, notice there, two very strange words together to describe those that he's writing to. Notice he calls them elect exiles, or perhaps you could say chosen outcasts. It's possible that the term may not be that strong, and it might even be better just to say that they're chosen by God, a positive term, to be strangers in the world. A Christian's homeland is heaven. Peter recognises that. We're citizens of heaven, and therefore Christians are like strangers in this world. I mean, if we're at home with God, then we're not going to be at home in this world. On the other hand, if we are at home in the world, then perhaps we're strangers with God. And so Peter reminds these struggling Christians of their identity as chosen strangers. And he goes on to explain why they should stand firm in their faith in Jesus. Let's just pick it up, if we can, at verse 3. You'll see it there on your screen. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith, for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice." So God is the giver of living hope to his people. In his famous account of life in World War II concentration camps, Man's Search for Meaning, the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observes that the prisoner who had lost faith in the future was doomed. With loss of belief, he also lost his spiritual hold, and he went into a complete physical and mental decline. It's a peculiarity of man, he said, that he can only live by looking into the future. Frankl identifies hope as a vital quality of human life. And the Apostle Peter agrees. With his readers facing persecution and abuse as part of everyday life, how does he encourage them not to despair? Well, he reminds them of their future hope. They've been born again, and as a result, they have a new hope, a new direction, a new destiny. Our human birth to human parents is a life that inevitably ends in death. It's a life and an earthly inheritance that perishes. It wears out, it doesn't last. It's a life that is defiled by broken relationships, failing health, human evil even. It's a life that fades. And so the human story is one that always ends in death. It never lasts, no matter what you've achieved in this life. But God does something remarkable. He gives a new birth and a new inheritance. And notice that it's God who does this for us. I mean, have a look there again in verse 3. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope. If you're a Christian, that's God's good work in you. You can't kind of cause yourself to be born again any more than you could cause yourself to be born the first time around. It's because of God's love and mercy that you can be born again and have this living hope. If you want to be born again, what Peter is saying is that you need to ask God to do it for you. And the way he has made it possible is through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And death is the greatest intrusion upon life. And so the only hope, Peter is saying, is for a resurrection. Your new life is because of Jesus' life. His resurrection is the reason and the proof for your resurrection. And your new birth is to a new life, a new inheritance that will never perish, spoil, or fade. And the one who made it possible is both guarding it and he's guarding you for it. That is, your inheritance is kept in heaven for you until Jesus returns. And in the meantime, as you trust in God, God is holding on to you until the time comes for this reality to be seen by everyone. How are they going to stand firm then in the trials that they're facing in Peter's day? Well, they need to remember their future hope. That's what Peter's saying to them. Our hope in God won't disappoint us. The goal of this whole section here in Peter's letter is to assure those who trust in Jesus that their eternal future is absolutely secure. He's very aware that there can, of course, be things in this world that can shake our confidence, that do shake our confidence. But our hope lies in what Christ has done. That is, he overcame sin and death. Jesus took on all of our sin, our shame, our sorrow at the cross. He bore the weight of our guilt. He suffered the punishment from God that was rightfully ours. But don't misunderstand the concept of hope here. I mean, Peter's not talking about the kind of wishful thinking in our experiences of life that often disappoint us. It's not the kind of nervous hope that I had perhaps when I asked Leonie to marry me. It's not the forlorn hope of somehow thinking that this football season will eventually get underway this year. It's not the hope that parents have that their children will be okay. I mean, often our hopes are quite hit or miss, aren't they? But the hope that Peter is talking about is the confident and certain hope that God will fulfill his plans. And God has already raised Jesus from the dead. We already are born again. Our inheritance is already being kept for us. So have you got what Peter is telling you here? If your trust is in Jesus, this is all yours. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. Not that it doesn't matter, but this is something that you can rejoice in no matter what is going on in your life. Well, I spent a fair bit of time on that particular point. Let me try to go a bit quicker if I can from here. Now, as Peter goes on, and we see that not only do they have a hope to rejoice in, but they also have a faith that is genuine. Let me pick it up at verse 6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honour at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Peter's encouragement to rejoice isn't because he's living in fairyland. Peter knows the difficulty of their daily lives. I mean, he's probably himself experiencing similar trials. And so he knows that daily life is full of struggles that are causing them grief. But compared to heaven, Peter says, they're only for a little while. And Christians are the chosen people of God, saved and kept secure, heading for a glorious inheritance where we will share in the glory of Christ himself. And yet the pathway to that inheritance will likely involve suffering and trials. It's a theme that Peter consistently reminds them of. So in chapter, a little bit further over in chapter 4, verse 12, he says, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you. We've been called to share in the glory of Christ, but as we head to this glorious inheritance, we're travelling in an unsafe world. Peter doesn't really say what kind of or how serious these particular trials are, but they're the kind of everyday trials that these people are facing. It's perhaps being sinned against by another person. It's illness and death and failure and loss, the terrible things that can happen. But either way, he wants us to see them as only lasting for a little while, compared to the eternal glories of heaven, that is. And so our hope in Christ points us beyond our trials, beyond despair. Our trials can't undo the certain future that God has secured for us and that we long for. But the other thing to notice is the purpose of trials in the Christian's life. Notice the "so that" there in verse 7. Trials in the Christian life are so that our faith might be tested and found to be genuine. The analogy of gold being tested by fire is actually a helpful one for us here. When gold is tested by fire, it's refined. All the impurities are burned away and the genuine article remains. It's similar with our faith, which is much more precious than gold. The trial is often the place of God's greatest work in us. If God takes you through a dark time, there's still hope, because God has a purpose for it. He's doing something special for you. He's doing something special in you. He's testing the genuineness of your faith, and He's purifying you for His purposes. And there's nothing more precious, can I say, than a genuine faith. Ultimately, it leads to a love and a belief that is secure. Have a look there at verse 8 and 9 with me. He says, though you have not seen Him, you love Him. Though you do not now see Him, you believe in Him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. You see, Peter contrasts the past and the present with the future here. They had not seen Jesus. They did not presently see Jesus, but they will see Jesus. Of that, Christians can be sure, and it fills them with an inexpressible joy. See, Peter doesn't urge them to be joyful here, notice. It's just simply stated as a fact. They're joyful. I don't need to have seen Jesus to love Him. I don't need to see Him now, somehow to believe in Him. And in that sense, we're kind of no different to Peter's readers. Peter saw Jesus. He hung out with Jesus. He heard Him speak. He watched Him heal sick people. He saw Him cast out demons, manipulate nature. He was there when He died on the cross. And he saw Him after He rose from the dead. And so Peter loved and believed in Jesus. And if you or I had lived in Palestine when Peter lived, then we could have seen Jesus as well. But it's not necessary for us to have seen Jesus physically to know and love and be filled with joy because of the salvation that He has won for us. The day is coming when Jesus will ultimately be revealed. Every eye will see Him. Well, what do we do with this? Well, you've always kind of got to ask the question, don't you? So what? That's a question that's important for us to ask. But God has done all of these wonderful things for you. And the Christian experience of being held by God in and through suffering is wonderfully encouraging. I mean, you have so much to rejoice in now, Peter says, and so much that is exciting that lies ahead. So what does that mean then for life now? What does it mean for us? Well, verse 13 actually, I think, begins to tell us. Have a look there at verse 13 with it. He says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, the therefore that begins in verse 13 looks back at all that God has done. And it says, therefore, this is what you should do in response. Now, our response is going to go beyond verse 13 here, but this is where we start. Therefore, he says, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you. Now, if your hope is fully on God's grace, then it's not somewhere else. Nor is your hope divided. Christians don't hedge their bets. They don't live partly for the future and partly for this world now. Their hope is set fully, completely, unswervingly on the gracious blessing of God that comes to us when Jesus returns. Remember our privileged status as chosen exiles. God has chosen you to be one of His people. He has set you apart for Jesus. He has given you new birth. You have an inheritance that's bigger and more certain than any of Rupert Murdoch's children. God is keeping your inheritance secure in heaven for you, and He's keeping you safe and secure for your inheritance. And in the meantime, He's testing and refining your faith so that you might share in the praise and glory and honour of Jesus Christ himself. See, here is the grace of God where you're to set your hope fully. Lay your foundations here. And the taller the building, the deeper you have to send your foundations, remember. And the deeper that you sink your hope into the solid and sure grace of God, well then, the more likely you will grow to maturity in your faith. The more likely you'll stand firm in the face of trials. The more likely you'll be found living the kind of lives that will cause others to glorify God. See, these are unprecedented days in our lifetime, aren't they? And we're called on to live by faith. And perhaps we could put it this way. Even if the supply lines should fail, and the shelves be empty, and the economy collapse, and the virus comes to our own city, our street, even our home, yet even then we can rejoice in the Lord. And listen to this prayer of the prophet Habakkuk when Jerusalem was being overrun by Babylon's armies. Habakkuk chapter 3 verses 17 and 18. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Will that be you?